So the first battle in the second stage of the Brexit negotiations with the EU became clear this week over the rights of EU citizens arriving in the UK during any transition period. The remaining 27 EU member states set out their negotiating position on Monday, prompting a response from the Prime Minister, who is on a trade visit to China. The latest immigration figures show that the number of EU migrants coming to the UK fell 19% to 230,000 in the 12 months since the Brexit referendum. And at the same time, there was also a marked increase in the number of EU citizens leaving the UK, totalling 123,000. The UK will leave the EU in March 2019, but there is then expected to be a transition period of up to 2 years. As part of the Phase 1 Brexit negotiations, which concluded in December, the government agreed that all EU nationals who have been in the UK for more than 5 years will be granted settled status, giving them indefinite leave to remain with the same access to public services as now. On Monday, the EU said it expects existing rules on freedom of movement for EU citizens to apply in full until the end of the transition period. But speaking during her trade trip to China, Theresa May said that she was clear there is a difference between those people who arrived prior to the UK leaving the EU in March 2019 and those who arrive after that date. The government is due to bring an immigration bill before Parliament at an unspecified date later this year, and they have commissioned the Migration Advisory Committee to examine how EU migration affects the labour market, but that is not due to report until September. Well, earlier, Brexit Secretary David Davis was answering questions from MPs. Here's a flavour of what happened.
The EU has made it clear that EU citizens coming to the UK during the transition period should be eligible for settled status. The Prime Minister says they will not be eligible. Is that a red line, or are the government willing to compromise on that? I thought that nothing was agreed till everything was agreed.
If you stay. Well, he's right. Nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. But the point, what I would point out to him, is that in the joint report, which we concluded and got agreement on in December, the European Union agreed that the transition date, the end date for ongoing permanent residence rights, not possibilities, but rights, will be March 2019.
David Davis there. Well, our Europe reporter Adam Fleming joins us now from Brussels. Adam, clear difference here between the EU and Britain in terms of what happens to EU citizens and their rights during transition.
Yeah, so it boils down to something quite technical, which is what was actually agreed by both sides in their joint report that they wrote up that was signed by Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker at that very dramatic week in December. Now, the UK points to paragraph 8, I think it is, which says all this kicks in, the stuff about citizens' rights, settled status, applying for that, having to register, that kicks in the day after Brexit Day, March the 29th, 2019. That's what David Davis was referring to. The Brits say that is what we signed up to. The EU say, actually, paragraph 5, if you read it carefully, says everything can be adapted and changed and renegotiated if that is required during the talks about the transition period. So the EU says, yes, you signed up to that date at that point, but things are different now because we're negotiating a transition period. And the EU is very clear that all that citizens' rights stuff doesn't kick in until the end of the transition period, December the 31st, 2020. That is what the crux of this disagreement is, and this is what's going to have to be hammered out by both sides in the next few weeks when they finally sit down to start settling the terms of this transition period.
How difficult do you think?
Very clear. They're saying this is what we're offering you.
Right, and on that, if that's what they're saying, they're not going to move, but it is a negotiation, as you said. So do you think there will have to be compromise over this on both sides?
So there is a difference of opinion in the Brussels bubble at the moment when you ask people about this. Some people think, oh, that was put in the negotiating directives by Michel Barnier and the EU. It's an impossible ask from the UK, for the UK. Therefore, it's something that's designed to be negotiated away so that the UK can claim a win. That's the kind of the cynics theory about what's going on here. Then you get the kind of the idealists theory, which is certainly amongst people like MEPs here in the European Parliament, which is that free movement is such an important part of EU law, such a fundamental thing about what the EU is about, and that the transition period is about the UK signing up to lock, stock and barrel EU law, that this is absolutely something that cannot be compromised on. So that tension between those two ideas will be what we see resolved in the next few weeks. And of course, remember, there's a tension for the UK here as well. Yes, on the one hand, they want to negotiate a transition period that is good for them and is politically palatable back home on things like free movement. But the longer it takes to actually agree that transition period, the less useful it is, because businesses want certainty about it as soon as possible. So there's a tension within the UK position as well.
Adam, thank you very much. We're joined here in the studio by the Conservative MP Daniel Kaczynski. Welcome to the programme. If the UK stays in the single market and the customs union during a transition period, do you accept that we have to observe the rules of the club, which includes freedom of movement?
No, not at all. And it's absolutely essential that when we pull out of the European Union in March of next year, the free movement of people stops. This was a very important issue for the British people when we voted in the referendum. They expected us to take back control of our borders and our immigration policy on the moment that we leave the European Union, and that is what has to happen.
So we are going for a sort of have your cake and eat it, which is we want the benefits of staying in the single market and the customs union during that transition period, but without the freedom of movement, which, as you say, many people voted on in the referendum.
Well, this is all part of the negotiating process, and we don't yet know the final deal. But what I would say is that we are a very important country, permanent member of the UN Security Council. We have the right to negotiate hard on behalf of our country. And I was very disappointed by what Mr. Sikorski said before, when, in my view, he was being rather disrespectful to the United Kingdom, in the sense that 95% of the world's growth is going to come, 95% of growth is going to come from outside the European Union, not from the European Union. And we have every right to negotiate our own trade agreements rather than being hamstrung by these people.
Right. Britain is being hamstrung by you and colleagues in the EU. Do you understand why this is such an important issue?
I'm very surprised that someone who claims to represent the Polish community in this country wants to limit its rights and the rights of EU citizens, and Poles are the biggest group in this country, to continue to live in this country. That's a peculiar position to take, but it's the outcome of Brexit.
Right, but Britain leaves in March 2019. No. So surely there are changes to the relationship that Britain has with the EU, including changes to the automatic right to stay or settled status for people.
There is no automatic right to stay. I'm an EU citizen in this country. I do not have the right of abode in Britain. It's conditional, it's movement of labour. I can stay here if I have a job. If I don't have a job and I start claiming benefits, I can be deported from this country after 3 months. And if you want to deport EU citizens who are a drain on the public exchequer, you can do it now. You don't have to leave the European Union.
So what's your response to changes to that during the transition period?
It looks to me like this automatic right of abode is actually an enhancement of the rights of some of the immigrants. But it looks like an attempt to claim victory where there isn't one.
What do you mean?
Because if you're claiming that EU citizens will lose the right of abode, which they don't have.
Right, but if they haven't got the chance to have settled status, which EU citizens do have the right to claim or certainly apply for, is that going to be a red line for the EU?
The transition period hopefully will be quite short, so 2 years I don't think will be a big stumbling block. There are much bigger issues.
Is it a red line for you? If the EU says no, if Michel Barnier says we want, as they have set out in the document for negotiations during transition, that this is a must, that EU citizens should have the right to apply for settled status and come during that transition period and bring family members, will that be a red line for you?
Oh, it's a red line squared. It is absolutely unacceptable. But Mr. Sikorski is playing very much a populist card. Of course we want to protect, and I speak as the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament, of course we celebrate the contribution of the 1 million Poles who are working and contributing to our society.
Yet you want to reduce the rights of anyone who comes from Poland during the transition period.
And those people who were in the United Kingdom before the referendum, the Prime Minister has stated that they have every right to remain.
Well, and the ones before March 2019, in
fact. Because they came to the United Kingdom under the premise that they thought that we were part of the European Union. Of course there are going to be changes as we pull out of the European Union and regain our sovereignty and control of our immigration policy.
So people like you who came here when Britain wasn't a member of the European Union won't be able to stay?
Well, Britain was a member of the European Union in 1978 when my family came to the United Kingdom.
Right, in terms of a transition, it is what it says. It's a transition. Britain is supposed to be moving towards full departure from the EU in terms of single market and customs union if the government goes through with what it has said up until now. So why shouldn't the UK set its own rules regarding freedom of movement?
Oh, it can, but look at those figures more carefully. Of course, you're counting foreign students who come to this country as in the net migration figures. You know, your universities are wonderful. I attended one of them. This is your success story, and yet you're portraying this as a defeat.
Right. On that issue, should they still be included in those figures?
Well, this is currently being debated within the Conservative Party.
Well, what do you think? Should student figures be included?
Yes, I do. I do believe they should
Why?
be included. Because there are many people who come here to study who ultimately end up staying
4%.
Staying after they finish
4%.
their studies. Well, it's still a figure, and those need to be taken into consideration. And we have let the British people down so many times over these figures as to how many people are coming into the United Kingdom. We need to get a grip, and we need to demonstrate to them that we have control over our borders. But Mr. Sikorski, as always, is trying to have his cake and eat it. The United Kingdom has handed over £400 billion to the European Union since we joined. We've been an extremely generous country to the European Union. We have done all sorts of things. We're protecting Poland by sending soldiers to Poland. We want a permanent NATO base in Poland. We want a strong relationship with our bilateral strategic partners. And yet he still wants to give us a hard time. That is not the way to engineer a constructive relationship in a post-Brexit world.
Is this about punishing Britain? I mean, Michel Barnier, Jean-Claude Juncker always say, no, it's not. But if you view it from
the British decision, which we respect.
It is a decision that Britain made. So, but is there a punitive element to it from your perspective, and will it be on this issue?
I think this fantasy should be realised in full to the extent that the radicals want it, so that the outcome of the experiment is known.
Right. We've heard the EU negotiating position on the transition period first. I mean, is there a problem here that the Prime Minister is reacting to the EU time and again, rather than setting out her own negotiating position first?
Well, I'm very honoured and delighted to have joined the European Research Group, which Jacob Rees-Mogg chairs, and I think that that group is really instilling backbone into the entire Conservative Parliamentary Party, and we are pushing for a very clear message to be given to us by the government as to what sort of a post-Brexit relationship they want to have. The uncertainty at the moment, it's gone on for too long, and we need to get down to the nub of the sort of relationship. We've talked about a Canada model, which Barnier has already offered to us, a Canada plus model. I think that could be one of the best solutions for us.
Right, and you said a vacuum has been created. Do you think that Theresa May should have set out more clearly what the end state should be in terms of the relationship between Britain and the EU?
Well, the person to blame, really, in all of this is Mr. Cameron, because he did no preparatory work whatsoever in the run-up to the referendum. All of that work should have taken place at that time. And unfortunately, Mr. Cameron decided, in his determination to convince the people to stay in the European Union, no preparatory work. That's why the Prime Minister is now having to work at double pace.
He is the former Prime Minister. Do you think that these negotiations can be effectively delivered by Theresa May?
Absolutely, and we must stand by the Prime Minister.
But only with interference, or rather support from your group that you are representing?
Well, the group is only saying what Theresa May outlined in her Lancaster House speech and in her Florence speech. We are absolute loyalists because we are peddling what she outlined very clearly in those two speeches.
Are you worried about drift in these negotiations, that actually Britain could still end up being in a customs union with the EU?
Yes, of course I'm worried, but I have every confidence in our country's ability to negotiate a fair settlement with the European Union. And unfortunately, there are many people, and it seems as if Mr. Sikorski is one of them, who wants to punish the United Kingdom for daring to pull out of this thing, which is going to be a supranational state. I know that in my lifetime, Poland will also potentially pull out of the European Union.
Well, let's
and
talk
we won't
about
be
Poland.
the last one to pull
well,
out
let's
of the
talk
European
about
Union.
Poland, Radek Sikorski, because do you support the EU measures, the sanctions against the governing party in Poland, whom the EU have accused of threatening to dismantle democracy and threats to the rule of law?
It's a tough one because we are a club of democratic nations. We freely signed up to the treaties which say that that rule of law should prevail, and it also is a fundamental principle of the European Union that institutions in member states should trust one another. If we couldn't trust the courts in another member state, then the security of legal interchanges between member states become...
But do you trust the Law and Justice Party to do the right thing in Poland?
They've subjugated the Constitutional Tribunal. Poland has no effective judicial review of legislation anymore. And politicians have now gained influence over the appointment of judges. Whether the EU can usefully affect that from outside, I have my doubts.
All right.
So it's a very difficult issue.
Let's leave it there. Thank you very much for coming in. And for more reporting and analysis of Brexit, check out the BBC News website. That's bbc.co.uk/Brexit.